Before that, however, it bore a very close relationship in the case of both India and China, and indeed Europe. It was industrialization and colonialism that broke that relationship. But now, or rather since approximately 1800, in the case of China and India at least, there appears to be the beginnings of a partial resumption of the old relationship between economic strength and population size, with potentially profound implications in the long term for the global distribution, not only of economic, but also political, cultural and military power. And you can see in this chart here, it would be better if it went back earlier, but you can see in the first half of the 20th century how the share of global GDP of China and India was falling, and how, well actually this starts around about 1980, it begins to rise again, and how completely out of accord it is with their share of the global population. And if I took this figure back to 1800, you'd see that basically their share of GDP, global GDP, was more or less the same as their share of global population. Now, the size of the Chinese market is partly what is attracting Western and Japanese multinationals to invest in China. But there is also another factor, more important at the moment, namely low labour costs. And this is also related to the size of China's population. In the case of the Asian tigers, the advantage they enjoyed in terms of low labour costs was relatively short-lived in historical terms, because their population was much smaller, and therefore the shift from the countryside to the cities took a much shorter time, 2 decades or so. China, on the other hand, enjoys what is relatively, though of course not literally, an almost unlimited labour force. The shift from the countryside to the cities will take several decades. Yu Yongding, a leading economist at the Chinese Academy of Social Science, who was recently at the East Asian Institute here, has estimated that even by 2030, at roughly present growth rates or a little less, the rural population of China will still be around 20%. An abundant supply of labour will mean that labour costs, unlike in the Asian tigers, will be very low for a long period of time. But perhaps the most important economic point to stress here is that because of China's sheer size, the global impact of its economic transformation is inevitably writ large. In a lecture given here recently, Hu Yangang, the Beijing University economist, described the scale effects of China and India in terms of population, labour force, economic growth, trade, resource consumption, and their impact on macro global statistics. And well, this is because China is so huge, then its impact is disproportionate. This is just for imports as a percentage of the global increase between 2000 and 2003. These over nearly about a third fixed investment, 60% oil consumption as a percentage of the increase, over a third. And if you look at growth, China's percentage share of world GDP growth during this period is, well, you can see it's somewhere usually between about 20% and 40% at the maximum. If China and India continue to grow rapidly, then over the period 2006 to 2015, Hu Yangang estimates, global GDP will grow largely as a consequence by the historically very high figure of 2.1% per annum. Or to put it another way, the impact of the rise of China on the global economy is likely to be far greater than that of the United States during the golden age between 1870 and 1913. Size has another important but rather different implication. China, like India, will be a very different kind of nation state. Of course they already are, but because they have been relatively weak, it has not carried great implication. But that is changing rapidly with their economic transformation. especially in the case of China. There has been much debate in the West about the post-war decline of the nation-state. This has had a number of different facets. Firstly, there has been the discussion in Europe about the decline of the European nation-state. And a Eurocentric mentality has easily and wrongly persuaded Europeans to think that this must also be a global phenomenon. Then there is the argument about globalization and how, in an era of global markets and multinational firms, this is constraining the power of the nation-state. Then, more recently, we find the discussion about failed states. There is substance to all of these arguments, but they are not politically disinterested either. In the post-colonial era, colonization is no longer an option for an imperial power like the United States, and therefore it has sought to limit the power and national sovereignty of countries by other means. This intent has acquired a new force and clarity since 9/11. In fact, historically speaking, I would argue that far from the nation-state being in decline, the reverse is actually the case. That since 1945, when the number of nation-states actually tripled, the nation-state has enjoyed a quite new kind of power and popularity. The point that is mainly missed by Western commentators is that the nation-state is firstly a relatively new experience for most of the world, and secondly, especially in a globalized world, it is the most important means by which people can exercise some degree of democratic control over their lives. An essential precondition of the success of East Asia has been the building of viable and effective nation-states, even in a place as small as Singapore. So what has this got to do with China? Two things. First, the growing power of China and India, far from reflecting the decline of the nation-state, is in fact a potent expression of the rise of the nation-state. Of course, these are not normal nation-states. On the contrary, they represent the emergence of a new kind of nation-state, in effect, the continental-sized nation-state, or if you like, the mega-state. In this context, it would seem that the future, in terms of the configuration of global power, is more likely to belong to nation-states, albeit very large ones, than unions of nation-states along the lines of the European Union or ASEAN. Presently, we live in a unipolar world, at least politically and militarily. But in 20 years' time, or rather less I suspect, the global order will have assumed, certainly economically, a very much more multipolar character, with China, India, the United States, the European Union, and Japan, perhaps, being the major players. You will note that only one of these is not a nation-state, 3 are Asian, 2 of them megastates. China, in this context, is a bearer of future trends, in its own right, and also because it is not alone, thanks to India. The rise of China could serve to reinforce the importance of the nation-state in another sense. It has long been committed to the principle of national sovereignty and non-interference. Of course, it is true that this position is usually in the self-interest of developing countries. It is, after all, a form of self-protection. But even when China is a lot stronger than it is now, these attitudes may persist, mainly because of its own historical memory and experience. Moreover, the fact that the world, on balance at least, is likely to become more multipolar in future decades, with China as one of these poles, perhaps in time the second most powerful, is likely to act as a constraint on those in the West who see virtue in weakening national sovereignty and the nation-state. Of course, in the medium to longer term, it is not clear how China might behave towards smaller and medium-sized nation-states. The United States, after all, was once a colony, but that has long since to influence its behaviour as a global power, except rhetorically. Why should the same not happen in time with China? Over the last decade, it has been extremely anxious to emphasise its good intentions, not least in Southeast Asia. Indeed, it has been at pains to reassure the world that China will be, in its words, a responsible power.